So today I'm going to be talking about developing for accessibility, and I'm going to be going over kind of some common problems in developing for accessibility and how we can fix those. So just real quickly, just to go over the basics, what is accessibility? Oh, okay. So accessibility means that something is capable of being reached, or it's capable of being understood or appreciated. So when we talk about websites being accessible, we're really talking about them being navigable and comprehensible. And there's a lot of different conditions that people may have that make it hard for websites to have these two things for them. Those are things like visual impairments, motor impairments, auditory impairments, and cognitive impairments. And we're mostly going to be talking about visual and motor impairments today. These are the ones that most directly impact the work that we do here. So just like some basic background, according to the CDC, about 11% of US adults are visually impaired in some way. And that doesn't include just like normal correctable vision problems, things like glasses and contacts, which, fun fact, is about 75% of America. And that ends up being about 36 million people. It includes things like cataracts or being legally blind, all kinds of things like that. Just to put that in perspective, that's almost the entire population of California, and it's about the same number of people as are just left-handed. And then this statistic was a little harder to pin down, but somewhere between 7 and 15% of US adults live with a motor impairment. I couldn't find specific statistics on motor impairments that would impede you from using the internet, but it's somewhere in that range. And so people with these conditions frequently need to use a lot of assistive technologies to access the internet, things like braille monitors, or screen readers, or other kinds of non-mouse and non-keyboard input devices. So when we're developing for the internet, we need to keep in mind that people are accessing our websites and using all kinds of different devices that we don't typically use.
Well, these days, right? Like phones and tablets.
All kinds of stuff, yeah.
Browsers, embedded browsers.
Yeah, exactly. And so why do we need to make the web accessible? For one thing, it's the law. Accessibility is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And just in 2017 alone, there were 817 lawsuits over inaccessible websites, and that was against both governments and private companies. And that number has just continued to increase every year.
And Patty, I'll point out we work for the government. And
right,
the public. So
yeah, we're under more scrutiny.
We're definitely under scrutiny.
Hit about it in Idaho.
Yeah, and just more importantly, it's the right thing to do to make websites accessible. Because like we said, we work for the public, and our salaries are funded by the public. So we need to make sure that we're giving everybody access to the things that they're paying for. And just in general, making the web accessible makes it a less frustrating place for everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about problems that affect screen reader support and keyboard navigation. So just jumping into it, problem number one is just overusing generic HTML elements. This is a really easy thing to do, and just as a caveat, I'm like extra guilty of doing all of these problems. So in doing this research for this presentation, there are a bunch of things that I realized I need to be doing better in my work. But this is like a pretty common example of a website. You might have like a sidebar and a header, a footer, and then a couple sections. It's really easy to just use a bunch of divs because they're just a generic unstyled element. Give each of them a class and you end up with a website that looks something like this. The problem is a screen reader can't understand the structure of this page. If you've ever downloaded and used a screen reader just to try it out, it gives you the ability to jump to different semantic elements on the page, like jump to the header, jump to a section. If you use only divs for the structure of the page, you totally eliminate the possibility of doing that. So this is pretty easy for us to fix. We can just swap out these for semantic elements, like a header and a footer. The sidebar can become an aside. This body class can become just the main element, and then each section can just become a section tag. And so HTML tags have semantic meaning, so it's important that we use the right tags based on what the structure of the page actually is. And there's actually like tons and tons of these semantic elements. And in doing research, I even realized that there were some that I've never used. Things like I've never used like a time tag to put around like a date or a time, but that makes it a little bit more accessible. And at the end of the presentation, I've got a bunch of links that you can go look at that have the full list of all the possible tags that you can use. So rule number 1 is just to let the browser do its job. And for the most part, HTML documents are actually pretty accessible by default. And the problems that we run into are usually when we try to override what the browser is trying to do. And so as long as we're just using semantic tags and not doing anything kind of weird that the browser doesn't expect, for the most part, a lot of accessibility problems are going to be taken care of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Div tags within those semantic tags. Is that fine?
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, you can use semantic tags in any level of nesting. You just want to use, like if you have a section in a document or you might have an article or something, you want to use the tag that means that that's what it is rather than a div. But you can wrap things with divs, and screen readers will just ignore those.
But if your whole structure is a div,
Yeah,
it's
if
gonna
it's
ignore
all a
everything.
div, then
You don't have to
that becomes
avoid
a
divs,
problem.
it's just the overuse is the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with like spans. If you're doing text, it's better to use, if you have things like underlining and italic and bold, use the actual tag that means those things instead of spans that have a class that make it look right. So problem number 2 is incorrectly associating elements. And a really good example of this is labels and inputs, because some HTML tags actually require that you manually associate those tags together for them to actually be accessible. So here's an example of like a common form. You might have a first and a last name, and each one of these has a label and an input. And this looks correct to anybody with normal vision. I can just tab through this, and I know what these inputs are talking about. A screen reader, though, doesn't understand that this input is associated with this label. So we have to manually tell it that. So one way to do this is you can put an ID on each of your inputs, and then you put a for tag on the label that says that this label is meant to be for this input, and that associates the two together. And then when a screen reader tabs into one of these inputs, it will announce that this is the first name tag. Another way to do this, you can actually reverse this and give the ID on the label, and then the input, you can say it's aria labeled by the first name, and it'll just find the first element with the ID and say this is what labels this input. I wouldn't recommend doing it this way. I think it's a little bit weird to reverse it this way, but it does work just as well as this.
Well, and Chris, I'm kind of confused. I think the biggest problem there is that you have two different divs, one div around the label and one div around the form input. But if they're in the same div, I thought the HTML would handle it.
It actually
Show a
doesn't.
good example, I'm curious.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of a common thing with accessibility. It doesn't. Screen readers don't make a lot of assumptions, and they do that because you run into problems if you mislabel inputs and buttons. So just to protect users, screen readers don't try to assume that this is labeled by this input, or this input is labeled by this label. You have to manually associate those two. There's other ways to do this. You can actually nest your input inside of your label tag, and that automatically associates it together. But if you have them separate, like in a lot of common HTML structures, it doesn't associate them.
What it was really bad, we have some old sites that are all done with TRTDs. So the separate cells definitely make the screen
Oh, right.
unable to associate.
Right.
I guess there's levels of bad, and that's the
Yes.
worst.
Yeah, exactly. So problem number 3 is attaching events to non-interactive elements. And I think that this is actually a really common problem that comes from, I think it comes from using reactive frameworks, things like React and Vue and Angular, just because those frameworks make it very, very easy to attach an event to basically any element that you want. So this form, for example, where's my mouse? So this looks correct to anybody, and this submit button actually will work because it's still attached an on-click function to this div and made it look like a button. But a keyboard user, when they tab through, they actually can't focus that button anymore because it's not really an interactive element. There's ways that you can tell the browser that it's interactive and still keep using a div, but it's not recommended to do that because that also makes it a little bit less accessible when you're manually saying what things are interactive. The better way to do it is just to make sure that once again you're using the right interactive semantic elements for things that are interactive. A button now, if I click into one of these inputs, I can now tab through and interact with this button. Problem number 4 is using HTML elements based on how they look. This is kind of the reverse of the last one a little bit, where this is a semantic element, a button, because we want this thing to look like a button. But the thing is, this is actually a link. What this is doing is it's setting the location to a page. And I see this a lot when you want something to look like a button but behave like a link. And so you use the semantic element that says it's a button. The right way to do this is just use the right element, use the actual A tag, because that signals to a screen reader that this is going to take the user to another page. And all these things, you can still style them to look however you want. You can take a link tag and style it to look like a button. But the real rule that we want to follow here is you want to pick your HTML elements based on what they mean instead of how they look. And I get it, because CSS can be really hard. And sometimes it's easier to just use something that's unstyled, like a div or a button or something that's you're not going to have to overwrite a bunch of styles. But it ends up being worth it down the road when you're trying to figure out your accessibility compliance. So problem number 5, and this I think is a really, really common one. I think if you take anything away from this presentation, it would be this one. It's updating the DOM without announcement. This is another one that I think has kind of arisen a little bit with the rise of reactive frameworks, because it makes it very, very easy to update the DOM anytime, any place. There's an organization called WebAIM, and they did a survey of people who use screen readers and other assistive technologies. The second most complained about thing was unexpected screen changes. That was the second hardest thing for people to deal with outside of CAPTCHAs, which that could be like an entire talk in its own, why CAPTCHAs are terrible for accessibility. Yeah, so basically what we want to do is make sure anytime we're updating the DOM with information that the user needs to know about, that we signal that to a screen reader. So here's another example of a form where we've got a first name input here and a button that when you click on it, it will call a function called handle submit. And so if we add that in here, this is a basic example of a React component. All we're doing here is anytime you click on this button, it's going to manually set an error in the state. And so no matter what you do, it's always going to show this error. And if there's an error in the state, we're going to render this paragraph tag. This is really common. Yeah, when you click on this, it's going to render this error. This works great for most users, but the problem is this error that just popped up isn't going to get announced to a screen reader because the screen reader doesn't know that this paragraph actually showed up in the HTML. One way that we can fix this is using this ARIA live attribute. What this does is this signals to a screen reader that this is a live element and that the contents of that element is going to get swapped out over time. And there's 2 different modes that we can set on this. There's polite and assertive. If you set it to polite, it'll wait until nothing else is being spoken, and then it will announce the changes. If you set it to assertive, it'll just interrupt whatever's being said and announce the changes. So you can do it either way. But there's actually still a problem with this code, and this is a common thing too. Even if you know about the ARIA live attribute, you can still use it wrong. Because what we're doing here is this paragraph tag doesn't exist in the DOM until there's an error. And if it doesn't already exist, that ARIA live attribute won't apply. What we need to do is have that paragraph tag needs to always be there. and add that attribute to it, and then we swap out the actual contents of the tag. As soon as that tag gets added to the DOM, it registers with the screen reader that this is an interactive element, and then anything after it gets added is what will get announced. There's also some other problems that we need to fix. For example, we need to go and associate this input with this label, but we also need to associate this error with this input. One way we can do that is with this aria described by. We put an ID on the error, and we say that this input is described by this error, and that lets the screen reader know that when the user tabs into this input, that it also needs to read out whatever is in this tag. And then also this aria invalid tells the screen reader that because there's an error on this input, that this input is no longer valid. And this is like this double bang, if you've never done that in JavaScript, that converts any variable into a Boolean. And then one other way that you can do this, instead of aria live, you can use the role attribute. If you set something to be an alert, it's similar to aria live assertive, where any update to this p tag will just immediately get announced. I personally think it's a little bit better to use the aria live polite, unless you know it's something that needs to get announced immediately.
What if you did aria live enable? That just closes the web.
Problem number 6 is relying on color to convey meaning. This is a common one I think that most people know about. If you rely just on color to show some kind of meaning in HTML, that becomes a problem for colorblind users. So we might have an invalid and a valid field. To somebody with protopia, which is a common form of color blindness, those inputs look very similar to each other and don't really mean anything anymore. An easy way to fix this is just make sure you add icons with your colors that also display the meaning of what your colors are supposed to mean.
You've never browsed the web on a colorblind person.
And there's
This is so frustrating.
And there's lots of Chrome extensions that you can download that will simulate color blindness in your browser. And I would recommend doing that if you're developing for the web. I would download some of those and frequently go and just turn those on and just make sure that your colors make sense. Sometimes even I've seen buttons will be against a background that to a colorblind user you can't even see the button at all because the colors end up being roughly the same. Problem number 7 is relying on icons to convey meaning. And this is another common thing too. You might have like a filter button is a common thing. For most people this makes sense. We know that this is something that you click on it, it's going to filter. Oh, you know, I have a mistake here. This actually should be a button, not a div. I did that thing. So with this image, one thing we can do is we can add an alt tag to this to say that this image actually is a filter. But this also doesn't say a lot to a screen reader because it's going to see that there's a button with an image inside and that the alt tag on the image is a filter, but it doesn't necessarily associate those two together. A better way to do this is, once again, this should be a button, but it should say aria label and open filter dialog, or whatever that button is actually supposed to do. Just say that explicitly in the aria label, and then it will announce when they tab onto that that this button opens the filter dialog.
You'd still want the alt.
Yeah, the alt is good too. Yeah, I mean that's not a bad thing to do. And if you're using SVG inline, alt tags don't work on SVG. You need to use the title tag in an SVG, just so you know. On an image, it works fine. Problem number 8 is relying on component libraries for accessibility. And this is actually a common one too. This is an independent review of the accessibility compliance of a lot of common component libraries. And a lot of them, even closer near the bottom, a lot of them have upwards of like 50 to 100,000 GitHub stars that are used in lots and lots of websites, but actually fail a lot of very common accessibility compliance tests. And I think it's fine to use a component library. I mean, it saves a lot of time. You just want to be aware of the sort of things that you're using. A lot of component libraries come with like fancy different select and drop downs, different like search components, and a lot of those things are not very accessible. They could be made to be accessible, but a lot of times component libraries will prioritize the styling of components over the accessibility. So I'd encourage you, if you're using something that is definitely not a native browser input, that you go and actually look at the code in the component library and just double check and make sure that the things that you're using are going to be accessible. Problem number 9 is relying only on ally scanners for accessibility. And this is another one too. There's a lot of tools that you can use to scan to find common accessibility problems. My favorite is Google Lighthouse, which is now built into Chrome. Another common one is the Wave accessibility tool. And these things will scan your HTML and try to figure out any possible accessibility problems. But these can only go so far. You can actually get a very high score in things like Google Lighthouse and still have your website be pretty inaccessible. I still think that you definitely should use these tools. They'll catch a lot of common problems that are really easy to miss. But you need to be aware that there's a lot of other things that you need to get right. I've left a link here. Somebody, as an experiment, tried to create what they thought would be the least accessible website possible that still would get a 100% score in Google Lighthouse. And it's pretty impressive what they do there. But there's a lot of things that you can do that won't be caught by a scanner.
Have you ever heard of Site Improve? Tennessee State has a license with Site Improve to scan their sites, and one of the things they do is accessibility. And they basically pay them to scan their site. They can't get past logins and things like that. So Site Improve does have a free app that you can install to use for things like this. I haven't done it yet, but
Yeah, I've never heard
it's
of
one
that.
thing
But...
we will be doing in Tennessee. I just thought I'd mention it for anyone else.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you an update if it works well or not compared to Google Lighthouse.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, Google Lighthouse is built in the Chrome developer tools now,
That's cool.
so it's pretty easy to go use. But yeah, that sounds interesting. I'd be interested to look at that. So just in general, I mean, accessibility is kind of like security on your website. There's no magic bullet that just makes the website accessible, just like nothing just makes a website secure. And there's a lot of things that you need to be aware of as you're developing your website. And I think it just takes a lot of...
Has left the conference.
I think it takes a lot of careful planning, empathy, and thorough testing to make sure that your website is accessible. I know by sad experience that it's a lot harder to try to retrofit a website that you've already built to be accessible than to just plan from the beginning to make things accessible. So kind of wrapping up here, as a challenge, if you've never done any of the things, I would encourage you to try out some assistive technologies. This is something I try to do when I'm programming for the web, is I'll just turn off my monitor and then sometimes also unplug my mouse and just try to navigate with a screen reader and see if I can figure out where I am in the page, what I'm doing, if it announces things correctly. And pretty quickly, often I figure out that a lot of things that look great to somebody who can see are extremely frustrating when you don't have your monitor on. Yeah, and let's see, NVDA and JAWS are the Windows. Those are the most common Windows screen readers, so I would go download those if you're on Windows. If you're on a Mac, VoiceOver is just built into Macs. So just go look at the documentation on how to turn that on. But yeah, I'd encourage you to go do those things. This is what I was mentioning before. There's now I think it's as of like 2 or 3 versions ago, the Chrome developers tools now have this accessibility section built in, and this is very, very useful. Even if you're not testing directly with a screen reader, this shows you the accessibility tree that it will hand off to the screen reader to use for announcement. And so you can see under the computed properties, like it doesn't have an ARIA label, it doesn't have a placeholder or a title. It gives you some hints about things that are missing that could make this component a little bit more accessible. And so at the end of the slide here, I just got a bunch of, these are a bunch of links that you can go look at that have all the ARIA attributes, all of the HTML elements. And then I think I also put in there, the Web AIM survey. That was a very interesting thing to read because they just asked a whole bunch of different questions to people who use assistive technologies about what kinds of things that they expect developers to do for them for the web. So I'd encourage you to especially go read that one. But yeah, I'm going to post these slides up somewhere. I haven't decided where yet, but I'll get you guys a link and you can go check out those resources. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.